to add an extra, there were scheduling reasons that we added the introductory session last time, and I think that was helpful to kind of get a lot of the basics out of the way. We had 2 questions submitted for this session, and they were really good. So I do encourage you all to submit questions if you've got them. One was, could I explain the difference between a theologian and a philosopher? And was Dante primarily a theologian? And then related to that is this question from another person: what is the difference between historical and theological allegory? I think probably that's a reference to the distinction between the poetic use of allegory and the theological use of allegory. And that is something that Hollander introduces in the introduction you've got in that volume. It's a very crucial question. It's a question we're going to be wrestling with throughout the course. There's rain outside my window here, which I would close it, but I'm going to get very hot. So tell me if it's too annoying, the pitter patter. Is it okay, James?
Fine, fine.
Yeah, really, we don't hear anything.
Okay, that's good. There are 2 basic ways you can use allegory. So allegory, as Isidore defined it, is alieniloquium, that is other speech. You say one thing and you mean another, right? That's what allegory is. And we have straight up allegories that you all know. Bunyan's, oh goodness, blanking on that.
Pilgrim's Progress.
Pilgrim's Progress, thank you. And then of course C.S. Lewis's Pilgrim's Regress. These are very accessible allegories, straight up. You've got figures that represent certain things, and they're usually named for what it is they represent: faith, hope, grace. So that would be a very common way of taking allegory, is that you've got these figures. Now, in Dante's mind, he's got a very important work, a very popular work that was widely read, and that was the Romance of the Rose. And that's an allegorical treatment of the troubadour conception of romantic love. So that was a possibility. And there's a lot of commentators who take Dante in the Commedia to be doing that kind of allegory, that Virgil represents reason and Beatrice represents faith or grace. That has a very long pedigree, and so it's possible to do it that way. I don't think that that's correct. It's not only is it mechanical and not very poetic, I don't think that's what Dante is doing. So what Dante is doing is very, very strange. I mentioned this last week in the letter to Can Grande, but even without that letter, which is disputed by some as authentic, it is clear that Dante wants us in some strange way to take the events of the Commedia as having happened. Now, why is that? Because we know that he didn't, I mean, maybe he's had visions of some sort, but he didn't crack open Mount Ida. Or if we were to go to Mount Ida on Crete and dig in there, we wouldn't find a statue that weeps tears that cause the rivers of the underworld to form, right? I mean, we know that's not literally true, but he is saying in some sense that what he's going to claim literal truth for what he's saying. Now, it's a different sense of literally true. The poetic use of allegory is like the Romance of the Rose. You've got something that's clearly never happened. You've got a person walking around dealing with figures that stand for ideas, and you know that's not a thing that happened in the world. Dante is claiming that his allegory, the allegory of the Commedia, is in fact the theological allegory. And so again, it's the outrageous claim that you should in some way treat the Commedia like as you would treat Scripture. And so that means that in the classic way of discussing the levels of, not levels, the different senses of Scripture, you've got the literal sense, which is what does the author intend to communicate by the thing that he or she is writing? And that depends on genre. So you've got the first 11 chapters of Genesis as being in a poetic, legendary kind of mode. You've got more historical books like 1st and 2nd Samuel. You've got the prophetic books, and so you've got the Psalms, which are straight up poetry. So you've got these different words from God according to the genre. But there's some basic sense in which the claim is for a believer that these are true in the relevant way. So that truth, whatever the author has in mind, the human author has in mind, is the literal sense. In that letter, the letter that is literally true in some way, are going to be spiritual senses. And these are classically arranged as the allegorical, even though you can use that word allegory to encompass all of the spiritual senses, but it's also naming the first one, which is to say that, for instance, as St. Paul, who does it in Corinthians, he says, when Moses struck that rock was Christ. So the rock that's being reported on in the wilderness wanderings, which is the literal sense, stands for Christ. So that's the allegorical sense in the specific meaning. We should take a meaning for our own lives. That's the moral or tropological sense. That is, we must understand that that the font of new life is Christ, or something like that, and then act accordingly. And then the anagogical sense is the sense of the eschatological sense, the sense of how does that thing point to the world to come. So I'm happy to go into that more, but I don't want to belabor the point. So that's, you've got the literal sense, and then you've got 3 spiritual senses. Dante wants us in some way to treat his poem as having the capacity to sustain that kind of analysis, at least on the level of saying that you've got something you're reading and it's somehow true, it's a literal sense, and then you've got a spiritual meaning to take from it. So that's his claim. So that's the, now, that answers, or hope it starts to answer that question about what does it mean to have these different kinds of allegory. The first question that was submitted had to do with, is Dante a philosopher or a theologian? My answer to this, and this is a hypothesis I want us to all test, I believe that he means himself to be a poet and he means poetry to be the supreme science. That is, it encompasses philosophy, it encompasses theology. Now, usually the claim is that theology is the architectonic science, the one that has the view of the whole and can arrange the whole. I believe that Dante means poetry to be that, take that place. So those are tidbits to put on the table. Part of the thing at stake here is, in the allegory, when we're reading these things that are happening, we're supposed to take them, I think, in dead earnest as applying to our lives. So in some way, I do believe that he's I mentioned this last time, he's flipping the anagogical sense, because the anagogical is the world to come. Well, the world to come is what he's traversing, right? He's gone into the afterlife, and so that's interesting, that the afterlife in a way has become the literal sense. So that's confusing and interesting. So he's giving us the anagogical as the literal, and now we're supposed to read into that what? At least we're supposed to read a moral sense. That is, how am I supposed to live my life if I read this poem and let it affect me the way that Dante means it to affect me? And I think that's on the table right from the start, when you have in the middle of our life, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. And that puts us in media res, right? The classic epic mode is to start a great poem in the middle of things, in media res. And that's what he does here. But it's not just the fact that there's an action that's happened before this, that Beatrice has come down to Virgil and sent him to Dante. It's not just that specifics and literal sense in which it starts in the middle of things. It's putting us in the middle of things. We're the subject of this poem. And he says that more or less in at least one place, but that it seems to me clear that what he wants to do in the beginning is to say, we all have our dark nights. The question is, what do we do to get serious about life? And here he's going to traverse 3 realms. He's going to traverse the realm of the underworld, which is the realm, we could say, of self-destruction. He's going to traverse the realm of purgatorio, of purgatory, and that's the realm of healing. And then traverse the realm of paradise, which is self-transcendence. And so if we're in the market for overcoming our self-destructive tendencies, getting healing, and transcending ourselves, then Dante says, I've got the poem for you. And the way to do that is to take, in some way, his dramatic scene. So he's got an epic setup in Media Res, right? It's an epic poem in some way, like the Aeneid. But it's very, and it obviously has lyrical passages, so he's got that mode going, but it's also extremely dramatic. And that's probably the thing that's going to strike anybody most about this poem, is the cinematic and dramatic character of these encounters, right? And that drama means we get to be in these immensely captivating situations. So that's going to be one way I want to start. I'm going to put another hypothesis here specific to this canticle. So the 3 great canticles are the 3 divisions of the afterlife. This canticle, the Inferno, I believe he's put a crux in front of us as far as having to try to understand what hell is about, because it's not just a modern concern to say, I'm not sure how just the setup is. And I think he's deliberately taking that head on. I'm going to say he's going to give a lot of indicators that he's not sure that we've gotten the setup right as a matter of general Christian teaching. I don't think he's a heretic. I think he's trying to deal with this situation honestly. And it strikes anybody who reads the Inferno with, well, that's part of the question, right? Because the commentators have this very strong tradition of saying, well, part of what, and Hollander is very much like this. He's great, but he's pretty moralistic. And part of the claim there is that one of the things that Dante needs to unlearn is pity. And I would submit that that's not correct at all. I think that's completely wrong, actually. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to work out here. That refers us to another aspect of this text, which I mentioned last time, and I would like to read a quote that kind of reinforces this. This great book by John Took that came out this year on Dante, he cites in his introduction a passage from the great critic Roland Barthes. He says, why is the writerly our value? Because the goal of literary work, of literature as work, is to make the reader no longer a consumer, but a producer of the text. And Took believes, I believe that, and most Dantists believe that Dante seriously means to make us co-producers of a text. It doesn't work very well, and it's not very interesting to take this passively. We can watch a lot of movies, thoughtful movies, and take them passively and not let them affect us. I don't know if you guys have seen, Katerina, you got to remind me here, Knives Out. Knives Out's a fantastic movie. It's a deeply revolutionary movie. But you could just take it and it wouldn't affect you. You've got to actually think it through. So any great work of art requires that. And Dante, more than any, you've got to, and he signals it. Many times he just kind of, not only does he address us as a reader and say, listen to me, there are puzzles throughout the thing that we are meant to engage. If we don't engage them, it's not going to be very satisfying. So that's one note. Another thing I want to say, just to wrap up here, I would suggest that we take we distinguish, and everybody recognizes, we should distinguish between the character who's traversing with Virgil at first, Dante the pilgrim. So he's the character who's growing, that we should be journeying with, identify with. There's Dante, of course, the narrator, and that's the one whose voice breaks in there, especially addressing us as reader. That's the narrator who's gone through the whole journey and is writing down from his memory, right? That's, again, the claim of the literally true nature of the thing, is that he's remembering something that happened. Okay, but I would also suggest that there's a third level, and that's Dante the poet. So that is the one who's constructed the thing. And in that construction are also problems or riddles for us to solve. So I think it's a very complex. So irony is set up anytime you have two levels. Well, you've got three levels here. So you've got a lot of irony, I think, going on here.